For those of you who just made it, again, my name is Gabby. I'm the president of Students for Social Justice, and here is my VP, Sara, presenting her awesome panel with our distinguished guests. So feel free to ask questions anytime you have them throughout our presentation and or afterwards. And thank you guys so much again for coming.
I also want to make a request that you guys keep yourself muted. I'll be able to do it myself if you forget, so don't worry, but we just don't want any static while people are talking. So I guess we're just going to launch right into it. So today we're going to be talking about the USPS. We have 3 guests with us today. We have Professor Shannan Clark, who teaches history at Montclair State University. He specializes in white collar work, but today he's going to be talking about the history of the USPS and unions and all of that. We have Carole Lynn Nowicki, who's an employment lawyer who works with K.S. Brannigan Law, who's my employer, so I might be biased if I'm extra nice to her today. She's an experienced litigator, and she works a lot with, arbitrations. And then also we have the lovely Rosie Romano, who is a labor lawyer. She works with Murphy Anderson, PLLC in Washington, D.C., and she'll be speaking about her experience representing the American Postal Workers Union and the Postal Police Officers Association. So before we start, I want to break down how we plan on doing this panel. We essentially want it to be in 2 parts. The first part, building a base of understanding so that we all can leave today reading the news and understanding what it means when they talk about unions, when they talk about the USPS. And we're going to use that first half, what we learned today from these experts, to on our second half, which is when we're going to talk about current news, the changes that are happening under Donald Trump, the injunctions that are happening to stop those changes, funding problems, COVID relief, all of that. So we're doing this for a reason. Hopefully, I know you probably have seen a lot of this in the news, but you probably haven't understood a lot of it. So by doing this first part, I'm hoping even when we get to the second part, we can have an open discussion between the experts and all of us, with all of us weighing in, whereas the first part is more question-based. Okay, so to start with, Shannan, the USPS is a constitutionally established institution. It's been around for most of US history. And it's considered a federal institution, a business, some might say, but it receives no taxpayer funding. It's self-funded through stamps and service fees. Can you talk about the role of the Postal Service throughout history?
Sure, be happy to. And again, very happy to be with you and everyone else in SSJ today. Can you hear me okay? Okay, 2 thumbs up. Fantastic. Right, the Postal Service is one of really a small handful of public services that are mandated under the Constitution of the United States. And this reflected a belief that democracy depended upon the free flow of information, that the informed consent of the governed required access to information. And that is why, in fact, it was important for Postal Service to be supported by the federal government. That included not only personal correspondence, letters between people, but also the news, right? So one of the things that the Postal Service did throughout the 19th century and continuing to the 20th century is offer very heavily discounted rates for the distribution of periodicals, for magazines, and for newspapers. Essentially functioning as a kind of indirect subsidy for journalism, for the production of news, and for the print media in all of its various forms. In 1872, the Post Office is elevated to its own status as a cabinet-level department in the federal government. And through much of the 19th century and even well into the 20th century, the Post Office represents one of the largest sources of total federal employment. The cabinet level position of Postmaster General is an office that allows the distribution of a lot of these jobs in the form of federal patronage to the political allies of the party in power during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the South, during Reconstruction and immediately following, some of these jobs are made available to African Americans, right, as part of the Republican Party's efforts to distribute political patronage jobs in the American South and to shore up support amongst African Americans for the Republican Party, which again, in the late 19th century is the party of emancipation, right, the party of civil rights. At the end of the 19th century and the very first years of the 20th century, we have the imposition of Jim Crow throughout the South by white supremacists. And one of the key battles in the imposition and instantiation of Jim Crow in the American South are efforts by white supremacists to deprive African Americans of access to employment in the post office, especially in sort of public-facing jobs as clerks, and especially jobs as letter carriers that would bring African American men into contact with white households. With the beginning of the Great Migration in the 19-teens and the 1920s, the movement of African Americans out of the South and into the urban North, we see the post office becoming an important source of jobs for African Americans in northern cities during the middle years of the 20th century. And then in 1970, we have the passage by Congress of the Postal Reorganization Act, which converts the post office from being a cabinet-level federal department into the United States Postal Service that we're all familiar with today, where USPS technically is an independent agency under the executive branch, but in practice sort of functions like a quasi-public corporation with a board of governors who are appointed by the president. But again, with this reorganization in 1970, the post office comes to rely much more heavily on user fees, right? And subsidies are reduced. The post office drastically curtails, for instance, the discounts that it offered to publishers of periodicals to circulate newspapers and magazines. And then by the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, we see really the elimination of most of the remaining subsidies that the United States Postal Service had still received after the reorganization in 1970, right? And so this sets the stage for sort of a seemingly endless cycle of increases in the price of postage, which is essentially paying the operating costs of the Postal Service in the absence of much more extensive federal funding that the Postal Service had received in its years as an actual cabinet-level federal department before 1970.
So then currently what we're seeing is that it is run by the executive branch, that's right?
Correct. I mean, it's administered by a board of governors who in theory act independently, but in reality, of the 11 governors, 9 of them are appointed by the president, and the other 2 are the Postmaster General and the Vice Postmaster General, who sit on the Board of Governors, but who are essentially appointed by the other governors, on the board, right? So the governors have to go through Senate confirmation, but, unlike other federal agencies, it's essentially self-sufficient. Off of user fees, right? And so this is sort of a trend that we see in other public services as well. We think of public higher ed, for instance, where, in the 1960s and the 1970s, the operating expenses of most public colleges and universities came from state governments, whereas now, that's almost entirely borne by students, in the form of tuition. I mean, my students can't believe them when I explain that even in the 60s and 1970s, the institutions like Montclair State University, were free in many states or very, very low cost. In the case of New Jersey, because the state government actually paid the operating expenses that are now funded out of tuition. So what we see with the Postal Service is not unique. It's part of sort of a longer term trend of disinvesting in public services.
What the impetus for that change was? What caused them to remove themselves from that funding?
In 1970, the reorganization of the post office, the creation of the United States Postal Service, the elimination of the previously existing Department of the Post Office as a cabinet level department, is driven by a combination of ideological factors and fiscal pressures. Ideologically, this fits in with what then President Richard Nixon described as quote unquote new federalism, an impetus to try to devolve various federal services either to lower levels of government or to sort of push them into kind of a gray area as quasi-public corporations, right? So we see this with, at least on a functional level, with the operations of the United States Postal Service. We see Amtrak, which is created also under the Nixon administration to provide for long distance passenger rail travel in the United States that essentially has a comparable structure. It still receives some subsidy from the federal government, but it's structured as a quasi-public corporation. And then even a little bit earlier, at the very end of the Johnson administration in 1968, we see the reorganization of the Federal National Mortgage Authority, which we all are more familiar with by its cutesy nickname Fannie Mae. That's essentially converted from being a regular federal agency into a quasi-public corporation. So there's definitely sort of an ideological trend at this time for the devolution of federal services. The more immediate fiscal pressures come from the rising federal deficits that are resulting from our disastrous war in Southeast Asia in the late 1960s, and the pressure that puts on the US government's balance of payments under a global economic regime in which the United States is still on the gold standard. And in fact, US dollar gold convertibility is what is essentially sustaining the entire economic system of the capitalist world. Once the US moves off the gold standard in 1972, the pressures of domestic public deficits don't necessarily jeopardize, the supply of gold that's available in Fort Knox or in the Federal Reserve banks. But that was a real problem still at the time that the decisions are being made in 1969 and 1970 to push through this reorganization of the post office, to convert it from the previously existing Department of the Post Office in the federal government to this new, independent agency that's technically under the executive branch, where the executive branch still appoints the Board of Governors, but where it effectively functions as a kind of quasi-public corporation.
So following this reorganization and the funding changes, in the long term, so what we're seeing currently, what are the financial risks that have been taken on by the U.S. Postal Office by having to support themselves? Especially, considering we talked about this briefly in a call that you and I had, the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, if you want to talk about that as well.
Right. So for the withdrawal of most subsidies, right, again, a lot of subsidies are cut with the 1970 reorganization. Most of the remaining subsidies are cut during the Reagan years in the 1980s, right? So having to essentially fund the operations of the Postal Service off of, people buying stamps, other user fees, inherently sort of jeopardizes the financial stability of the system. But the passage of the 2006 legislation, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, really is the source of most of the sort of dire financial crisis that the postal system has found itself in over the last decade and a half. The 2006 legislation required the United States Postal Service to pre-fund 75 years worth of retirement benefits, including healthcare benefits, for its workers. This is a requirement that no other federal agency has. And moreover, this is a requirement that no private business actually has in the United States. It essentially means that the federal government, that the Postal Service has to set aside about $5.5 billion every year, again, to pay for retirement benefits 75 years down the road. Effectively, the Postal Service is required to pre-fund the retirement benefits of individuals who haven't even been born yet, right? Someone who'll be born in 2025, who might take a job with the Postal Service in the year, 2050, work for 30 or 35 years for the Postal Service and then retire. Their healthcare benefits and other benefits in retirement already have to be paid for as a result of this, utterly unprecedented financial requirement. The Republicans passed this legislation in 2006 explicitly to create a kind of artificial financial crisis for the Postal Service, to try to push the Postal Service into insolvency and to use these chronic deficits that result from pre-funding of retirement benefits as a kind of rationale that they would hope to use for the eventual privatization, full privatization of the Postal Service. This pre-funding mandate was eliminated. The financial problems facing the USPS would be enormously reduced, to a kind of a manageable scale that could be alleviated with, relatively modest subsidies, even returning to the levels of the late 70s, early 1980s.
Do you foresee, I know obviously you're a history expert, you're not a fortune teller, but do you foresee an instance where this structure and funding might ever change? Are there historical precedents where unions or workers were able to advocate for change in this way?
Certainly, if we look back to 1970, at the moment when Congress and the Nixon administration are contemplating and beginning to move forward with the reorganization that happens that year, we see postal workers embarking on what at the time is not a legally sanctioned strike, but spreads nationally very quickly in March of 1970 and effectively shuts down the entire postal system in the United States. In some large cities like New York, National Guardsmen are brought in a kind of a not very effective effort to sort the mail. But the National Guard can't do it. And postal workers have, over their jobs acquired enormous amounts of skill to do the work that they in fact perform. And so ultimately the federal government has to capitulate and to give the strikers in 1970 most of what they want, to significantly increase pay for postal workers, but also to establish the form of collective bargaining that the various multiple unions that represent postal workers have today, by including explicitly in the final version of the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, the inclusion of most postal workers under the National Labor Relations Act, which is the fundamental piece of legislation in the United States that pertains primarily to workers in the private sector, right? So this is one way in which postal workers are able to make the reorganization as a quasi-public entity sort of work to their advantage. They enjoy greater rights under the National Labor Relations Act than regular types of federal workers do.
And that's actually a great transition into unions. Thank you, Shannon, for all that. So Carole, I'm going to start with you. Can you answer for us, because I know I'm not an expert on unions. I doubt most of the people here are. Can you answer, what is a union? What's their purpose?
A union is an organization of workers that come together. They have a community of interest, and they're authorized by statute, which Shannon just mentioned, to create a collective bargaining unit. And that bargaining unit negotiates on a large scale with either an employer or an industry. regarding the terms and conditions of employment of all of the union members. And those negotiated terms and conditions of employment are then memorialized in what's called a collective bargaining agreement. Now, if you want to know why that's significant, a large portion of the American workforce is what we call an employee at will, which means that the employee can be fired for any reason at any time or for no reason at all. A small portion of the workforce may have employment agreements that limit termination, but those are more often at the executive level than the lower level. And when an employee, so employees are really facing their employers on an individual basis, these employees at will, and even the ones who have employment contracts, individual employment contracts. And if they have a dispute with their employer or a concern like discrimination, they are, they have to address this by themselves with their employer. And it can be a very intimidating process. There's an imbalance of power. An employee may not have any leverage because the employee needs a job and is, may be concerned about retaliation for making a complaint. So over the years, a mechanism has come into play where employment laws have been developed to give employees protections for a variety of things that sort of fall under an umbrella of unfair treatment by an employer. So these statutes have been enacted at the federal, state, and sometimes even the local level. And some of them may allow an employee to bring a private lawsuit or arbitration. Sometimes the statutes allow an agency to pursue a claim, a government agency to pursue a claim based on an employee complaint. Or sometimes the employee has the choice of whether or not to pursue the issue on his or her own, or to file a complaint with the agency, or both. So, and with respect to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, it's actually a prerequisite to file a claim with the agency before a lawsuit can be filed. So what the statutes do is they mainly lay out what employers are prohibited to do, and they provide mechanisms for employees to obtain relief if there are violations of these provisions. And that type of relief can be in the form of damages, back pay, attorney's fees, possibly even reinstatement if an employee has been terminated as a result of the issue or feels that the employee was wrongfully terminated. So when I said that everyone's an employee at will and can be terminated for any reason or no reason at all, there is a caveat to that. An employee cannot be terminated for an unlawful reason. So types of employment laws cover a variety of issues: salary and wages, equal pay, safety issues, whistleblower issues. If an employee makes a complaint to the employer about unlawful conduct in which the employer is engaging, there's often a concern by the employee that he or she will be fired or retaliated against in some way for making the complaint, or reporting the employer to either law enforcement agency or a government agency. And so there's whistleblower statutes that give employees protections in that situation. There's sick leave laws, medical leave laws, there are anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation laws. And often these are so complicated that employees really need to hire employment attorneys like me in order to help them navigate their way through this. And as a result, they may incur attorney's fees. So, one of the mechanisms in the statutes, if an employee prevails on some of these claims, there's an award of an attorney fees available to him or her. But so based on now, generally speaking, all workers in the United States are eligible to avail themselves of these employment laws. But some of them actually exclude either government workers or workers who are subject to a collective bargaining agreement. And the reason for that is there's an expectation that either the concern that's addressed in the statute is either addressed in another statute that's specific to government employees, or it will be addressed in the collective bargaining agreements of union workers. However, not all of them are, and if a union is decides not to pursue it, or a claim is outside the collective bargaining agreement, even a union worker can certainly pursue them. But that leads me into what might be in a collective bargaining agreement. So the collective bargaining agreement, as I said, is the agreement that derives from this group negotiation, this large organized group of negotiation between workers and the employer. And they cover things like wage and salary, vacation time, benefits, pension and retirement benefits, health benefits, possibly health and safety requirements, how layoffs, reductions in force might be handled, whether the employees have to receive notice, how much notice, whether they're entitled to severance payments. There are also grievance procedures, so which is progressive. So if an employee, a union member, has a complaint about something in the workplace, the union member can go to the shop steward, who is the local union representative on site. At that point, the shop steward will either will investigate the claim and determine whether or not to pursue it with management. But the union then takes over the claim and becomes the advocate for the employee. So with respect to any issue that might be contained within this collective bargaining agreement, an employee, might not need to hire an employment lawyer, because the union is going to advocate on behalf of that employee based on this contract. And
to clarify though, a union worker has the ability to contact an employment lawyer if the union doesn't follow up with that request.
Well, always, and a union worker can always contact an employment attorney, but sometimes it makes more sense for the union to pursue the claim if there's something there. It may result in a much quicker resolution. There's a mechanism in place in the collective bargaining agreement, usually regarding, kind of progressive steps as to how a grievance will be addressed. And the union representative will try to negotiate a resolution with management. And then if that doesn't work at that level, it goes up to another level and can ultimately result in an arbitration. But the union kind of takes over this issue and potentially resolves an issue that not only impacts that employee who complained, but everyone who works there. There's also in the collective bargaining agreement often disciplinary procedures that are progressive. So this gives a union workers protection against this kind of arbitrary termination, because there are steps that have to be taken if an employee does something wrong, if a union worker does something wrong. And first they may get a written warning, next they may get a short-term suspension. Following that, they may get a longer suspension or a termination. And there's a hearing mechanism so that the union worker can appeal the decisions that are made. Now, because and sometimes even these collective bargaining agreements have discrimination provisions in them. So, or equal opportunity provisions. So, equal employment opportunity, I mean. So, in that sense, even that kind of issue might be able to be resolved at the union level. But because of, the negotiation happens between the union and management, managers and supervisors cannot be part of the same union as their subordinates. And they become the voice of the employer. And sometimes, very often, managers and supervisors are non-union workers in any given organization. The union becomes a very powerful force because of its, large numbers. And if once these collective bargaining agreements kind of expire and come up for renewal, if the negotiation starts again on the terms of the new agreement, if the parties cannot reach a consensus, unions can actually go on strike. And we saw that a few years ago with Verizon. This can be very detrimental to the employer, and it gives the union a lot of leverage against the employer to effectuate the changes that are needed. It allows some push. Also, the union can push back on some employer policies that may be unfavorable. We saw that over the summer when the Postmaster General imposed some restrictions we're going to talk about later regarding overtime pay. There was a lot of pushback by the unions and some others that, was very effective. So,
Not to cut you off, Carole. I'm sorry. We have to move on to the next question. I'm sorry. We're a bit short on time. I got the red light from my president. So thank you all for that, though. And I think it's important. I like the point that you made about the reason unions exist is the leverage that they have. They can do things that a single worker cannot achieve. And that's why I want to bring the next question to Rosie. We like to think that people that are in unions are happy with it because they're achieving something that they couldn't get on their own. But are most union employees, and specifically in this case, postal workers, given the topic today, generally satisfied by union representation?
Sure. So, unions generally operate sort of as a mini democracy. They have a lot of the same voting provisions and things like that. They get to choose their leaders. They ultimately often get a vote on the collective bargaining agreement. Sometimes it goes into effect even if they don't approve it. But the members of the union, the dues paying members who I'm talking about, they are active in the union administration. So to the extent that they don't agree with what's something that's going on, they can say so and sometimes effectuate change in that way. Now, there are certainly people that are covered by a collective bargaining agreement who choose not to join a union to be dues paying members. Those folks certainly may be dissatisfied with the representation that they're getting. They're not eligible to vote in most union elections. They may not vote on the collective bargaining agreement. But because they are part of the unit, they are certainly eligible to pay their dues and become, voice their concerns in that way and become a voting member.
An option available then for those who don't want to join a union.
Say that again.
Right, there is an option available for those who don't want to join the union that covers their work or their industry.
An option in terms of?
Not joining it.
Yes, they can certainly not join the union. The union will still represent them. So I mean, as Carole was talking about through the grievance procedure and things like that, they're still covered by the collective bargaining agreement. If they're terminated unfairly, the union is still required to provide them fair representation under the National Labor Relations Act, which applies to the postal unions. Unions have to provide, they have a duty to provide fair representation to everyone in the bargaining unit, regardless of whether they're dues paying members. So as a union lawyer, I'm not going to stand here and say that you should work at a union workplace and not pay dues. That certainly does not allow the union to function as effectively as it otherwise would, but there's a variety of opinions on that issue, and I don't want to force anybody into that if they don't want to.
No, of course.
Speaking about the postal unions in general, so there's 4 major postal unions, and then there's a couple smaller ones. The employees in the Postal Service have a very high rate of being dues paying members of their postal union. That generally shows a high degree of satisfaction, or at least a high degree of being engaged and wanting to make a difference in their workplace. I mean, even just speaking generally about postal employees, they are some of the most engaged and dedicated employees that I've ever met. They want to do their job, they want to do it right, they want it to be fair. So they're very engaged in that way, and it's sort of unique compared to some of other workforces that I work with. And so because of that sort of engagement, I think they're generally, fairly satisfied with the representation that they're getting.
So you brought up, there are 4 different, you said, postal related unions. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's 4 major ones, and then there's actually 4 minor ones as well.
Okay. So how does one, I mean, how do they differ then? Are they about different issues? Are they covering different employees?
Yeah, so each union covers a different group of employees. And I think Carole mentioned that each collective bargaining unit kind of makes up a community of interest. So they share the same job, they have the same supervisors, the same sort of day-to-day work. And so each bargaining unit covers a different group of those employees. So for example, my firm is general counsel to the American Postal Workers Union. That makes up the postal workers. Those are folks that operate the postal facilities. They will, janitorial staff, but also public facing folks like postal clerks that you'll see at a post office. I also represent one of the smaller postal unions, which is the Postal Police Officers Association. And that's a group of about 500 police officers that are employed by the Postal Service to combat mail fraud. So those are sort of the 2 extremes. I mean, the APWU, the postal workers, make up about 330,000 employees nationwide. So there's sort of a wide breadth there between the major and the minor unions.
Now, I think it's time that we move on to the current events, if you guys are prepared for that, unless you had any other points you wanted to make about unions and USPS. No, okay. So the first thing we'll talk about is the changes that have been happening with the USPS. And I want to point out again, since we have about 20 minutes left, so we'll bang this out as much as we can. I'll stay on after if people would like to talk. I'm not going to force our experts to stay. They all have lives, but feel free to stay if you all want to have a discussion. It probably won't be as fact-checked as we have with these people, but certainly it'd still be illuminating. So in regards to the changes that have happened recently, we're going to go in order of time, right? So in 2018, President Trump issued an executive order for the creation of a task force, which was supposed to provide recommendations about how to overhaul the USPS business model. The statement released by this task force urged cost-cutting and price increases as a way of getting rid of the USPS's debt. It also called for absolutely no delays at any time and was very strict in this measure. I will be actually sharing at the end of this sources for all of what I'm going to be talking about, so you can read that memo yourself. And specifically, I want to highlight one quote which talked about this changing expectation, this refusal for delays, and it said, "We may see mail left behind or mail on the workroom floor or docks," essentially saying, get it out as much as you can, and if stuff gets left behind, leave it. So I mean, this is clearly a change in the culture of the workplace. Rosie, you've worked with these unions. Have you seen how they're affected by this? If it's hurting them, if they're in support of these changes, whatever you might have to say.
Sure. So, postal workers generally have this ethos that all mail goes out every day. So that means that there's not mail left behind. There's not mail on the workroom floor. I've talked to postal workers and letter carriers, the people that deliver your mail each day, that's a letter carrier. And they are disturbed by mail being left behind at the end of the day. Under, prior rules and currently with the many injunctions that are in place across the country, supervisors and even line employees, union members, take mail that's left behind to the next place that it needs to go. So if it's left at a post office, they take it to the facility so it can be processed. That's just something they do in the course of their duties. And it certainly is extra time, and it's often overtime. But I think what's important to understand is the Postal Service is this massive, well-oiled machine. They deliver to every single address in the country. Under the law, they have to. And so even little incremental changes, ending overtime or changing policies has a massive impact on this sort of machine as it operates. So I think, just even making small changes, of course it affects the workers, and of course it affects folks who are expecting to receive their mail and their packages.
And then in terms of, I mean, because what we're seeing here, like you said, we're seeing a cut in overtime. We're seeing a willingness to leave mail behind. Is that going to affect the arrival of essential mail then? Is it going to affect ballots, right? I mean, those had to be sent out at the very latest by yesterday. Are they going to get there on time? Is that a worry that we have to be thinking about?
Absolutely. And the Postal Service takes election mail seriously, and so do the workers. It's segregated out in separate buckets so that, if it's the last tray to go, it's the last tray to go. But I think there's been a lot of concerning stories, especially within the last week or 10 days, that it may not be happening everywhere. So, frankly, if you haven't mailed your ballot at this point, you've got to figure out a way to get it in person. That's just the reality of it at this point.
And then, so this was in 2018 that this task force was formed, right? So if we've talked about the changes that have happened over the last 2 years since then, but in August of 2020, we finally had the experience of the Postmaster General DeJoy speaking at the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, not necessarily defending his practices, but saying that he didn't explicitly order them, and that everything that just happened, the removal of blue collection boxes, the removal of mail processing equipment, which has been big in the news, the cutback on hours and overtime, he didn't explicitly order it, but he committed to suspending them. And the House in general has been trying to pass a bill, that is called the Delivering for America Act. And it would essentially do what he's committing to suspending these activities until the end of COVID or January 31st, whichever comes first. While that passed in the House, it has not been presented on the Senate floor, understandably. There are other options to stopping these things, which we have seen, these injunctions, but have they been successful? I mean, are they actually preventing the success of, they're preventing the removal of boxes or the cutback of overtime hours? Have any of them actually worked, I guess is my question, these injunctions?
So yes, at least in the short term, they're largely working. There are certainly hot spots around the country where local managers are failing to comply with the injunctions. But on the whole, yes, they're working.
What would be the reason for
the
managers?
Problem with the injunctions is.
Sorry, my internet was slow, so I didn't get your response until after I started talking. Sorry.
No. So local managers are. It's what's the problem with local managers in any big company? They feel like they have power and they make a decision, and that's just the way that it goes. I can't explain it, and it's frankly something that the court wants explained to them right now too. So watch the news, maybe we'll find out. But as I was saying, I mean, the problem with these injunctions is that they're fairly temporary. The courts still have to rule on the merits of these cases, and some of them are proceeding quite quickly. But ultimately, the outcome here for many of these cases will simply be for the Postal Service to go through the proper channels to make these changes. The big fight is that they just made them without any consideration. They didn't go through what's called the Postal Rate Commission, which is supposed to review nationwide changes like this. So ultimately, a court could find that the Postal Service was wrong in what they did, and the fix is the Postal Service will go through the Postal Rate Commission, and they could get approved anyway.
And there was another change. So you work with the Postal Police Union, and I want to talk about that because while we've heard in the news about the removal of blue boxes, we've heard about the removal of mail processing units, no one has talked about the recent change in jurisdiction that postal police are going through right now, which you're dealing with as their union representatives or as their lawyer, whatever, I don't know the term, but can you talk about that change that in their jurisdiction?
Sure. So this is a change that came down literally the day after Postmaster General DeJoy testified before Congress. It was a change that came from sort of the upper management of the Postal Inspection Service, which is the law enforcement arm of the Post Service. And it basically said that postal police officers who used to, patrol neighborhoods to assist letter carriers or set up surveillance at blue collection boxes that were getting mail fished out of or stolen from. They are now restricted from carrying out their duties on postal property, which means postal processing facilities or post offices. And, you know, removing police officers from the streets during a time where folks are concerned about the safety of their election mail and, you know, other slowdowns that are occurring in the mail that may be the result of policy changes or it may be the result of some nefarious action, seemed extremely suspicious to us. And so on behalf of the union, we've filed suit and moved for an injunction, and that is currently pending. It's been pending for about 4 weeks, which is much longer than any of the other suits that the state AGs and other organizations brought. So we'll see what happens with that. But there are some news stories out there, I will note also. So if you want to learn more about it, I'm happy to talk about it once we hit the time limit here or point you in that direction.
That'd be great. Thank you. Yes, so I will, because Carol, I know we were going to talk about emergency funding, but I want a quick segue into the votes and then we'll go back to emergency funding if that's okay with you. So, because you brought up a great point, which is folks are worried about their mail-in ballots arriving on time, which obviously we're at a point where it's just not going to happen. Regardless of what's going on with the post office, it's a week before the election, it's not going to arrive, or at least the chances are very slim. But prior to this, over the last month, I mean, the idea of the postal police not being present on the street, the idea of setbacks because of a lack of overtime being allowed, of mail processing equipment being removed, was it safe at any point in the last month to send our ballot? Should we have been worried much earlier about it? Should we have made the commitment to vote in person or early? I mean, if any of you can speak to that, I mean, I don't know if that's a question you can answer, but I think it's definitely worth one discussing.
So in general, I think if you got your ballot in early, I think it's safe to assume that it's going to get delivered. I think the problem with mail-in voting and with people relying on the Postal Service to turn around a 2 or 3 day delivery is the problems we're experiencing right now, where there are delays of longer than 2 or 3 days. So the ABW at the very least was very active in making clear that voting by mail is safe. You just need to do it early. And I think that's the message we still have. Unfortunately, it's not early anymore, so don't do that.
All right, now we can go back to funding because this has obviously been a big issue over this last summer specifically. So, I mean, obviously throughout this entire talk, we've been talking about how the USPS has been struggling with its funding for years, since the 60s or since the 70s and 80s, as Shannon was talking about. So, but now because of COVID, we're seeing even, you know, that debt raising higher. So in July, the USPS reached an agreement with the United States Department of Treasury for a $10 billion loan provided in the CARES Act. So Carol, could you speak to the conditions that were associated with that $10 billion loan, the terms?
Yeah, the terms are pretty onerous. I don't think any corporation would be happy with these. So it imposes restrictions on the money, first of all, that it has to be used for, this was actually written into the CARES Act. It has to be for, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, an inability to fund operating expenses without borrowing money. So that's been incorporated in it, but it also imposes limitations on how much can be borrowed or when money can be borrowed, a maximum on the advances that can be made. And every 30 days, the Postal Service has to make an application for an advance. And with that application, there are certification requirements, a plethora of financial documents that have to be put together. And this was a condition precedent, which was actually kind of a sticking point with the Postal Service in prior attempts to get loans from the government, is that the condition for this loan is the Postal Service will then have to turn over copies of its agreements with large mailers with whom it has special pricing programs. And now, one of the issues that the Postal Service had before was that this was these are confidential agreements, and how can you turn them over to a government agency, or they were receiving funding before from a corporate, a bank that was actually that's overseen by the U.S. Treasury. And so now there are supposedly some confidentiality provisions that have been put in place, but I haven't actually seen how broad or limited they are. And another issue with the terms is that the Treasury determines in its sole discretion whether an advance request has been made in accordance with the loan. And so between all these limitations on getting the money and the Postal Service, the Treasury Department having the opportunity to kind of control whether or not the money is issued, it really takes away the Postal Service's autonomy. And then if there is a default, which of course the Treasury Department also gets to determine in its sole discretion, the Treasury Department can decide that it's not going to make any more payments to the Postal Service, or even accelerate the amounts due. And this would, of course, result in exactly what Shannan was talking about earlier, and completely result in the insolvency of the Postal Service, which already came out and said that without additional funding like this, although they were hoping for a grant, that they will not be able to operate after September 30th. Now we're already past that date, and there are some provisions to help them get, receive this funding, but there's always a risk that it will not, the funding will not come forward, it will not be given to them, and then where does that leave the Postal Service?
So that was perfect timing. Thank you, Carole, in terms of all that. So we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask now, I think this is a great time before they have to leave. So feel free to just unmute yourself. If you're interrupting someone, we'll battle it out.
Hello?
Hi, Jenny, we can hear you.
Okay. So just a general question. What do you think is like the future of the post office will be, like, in your opinion, given all these concerning issues that happened?
So I can paint a rosy picture that may not be possible. But, a lot of it depends on who's elected to Congress, what kind of laws are passed, and things like that. But the unions have envisioned improvements to the Postal Service that could really expand their place in our society. Allowing postal clerks to do basic banking. Folks who don't have access to regular bank accounts would be able to, have a basic bank account somewhere to send checks through the Postal Service. We could expand passport services that the Postal Service already does some of. There's a lot of sort of core functions of our society that the Postal Service is set up pretty well to carry out. I mean, they have offices in every city almost. They are acquainted with every single address in the country, as I mentioned before. It's sort of a unique business that they've built to have access to all of these corners of the country to provide necessary services. So I think, one of the things in thinking about how is the Postal Service going to be sustainable, without huge amounts of money from the government every single year, we have to get creative. We have to think about these other services that they could provide and the fees associated with those, and interest if you're holding money for folks and things like that. There are solutions out there, and I think rather than just sort of thinking about the gloom and doom of it, you have to get a little bit creative.
I actually want to ask a question. Oh, Brandon, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to bring up a little more doom and gloom. So as far as I know, the U.S. Postal Service is the only postal service in the world that delivers to literally every last mailbox in the country. And a lot of these people like in these like far out places require medicine to be delivered and such. So what would happen if like the USPS is really stretched to its last dollar and can no longer deliver to these places and like privatization takes over? Like what would happen to these people in the places where, you know, these private companies won't necessarily deliver as soon as the USPS would?
It's a great question. And we don't know. You know, if folks who need medication, things like that, maybe there's a central place where those things would be delivered rather than sending a letter carrier out on a helicopter to deliver their mail every day. But that puts a lot of burden on each person. And frankly, Congress would have to change the statute to require or to permit that mail not be delivered to every single address. You know, you'll notice in newer neighborhoods that there are changes that are being made to make mail delivery a little bit more efficient. For example, in a lot of suburbs, you'll just have the box of mailboxes rather than a mailbox at each house. That makes it a lot quicker for letter carriers to deliver mail each day. So I think there are some solutions, but I think particularly for rural folks or people who live, you know, only a helicopter ride or a boat ride or something away from the mainland, it's a real problem, and I don't have a good solution for it.
John.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see me? We're okay? All right, well, here's the thing. What's the possibility of having the ridiculous 2006 law changed so they don't have to pre-fund the pensions? I think that's sort of where the trouble, the knot of the trouble is. Maybe Rosie or Carole Lynn can answer that. Thank you.
Yeah, so at different points, the Democrats have come up with plans, and I know the APWU does a lot of Okay, sorry, I was muted by the host. So there's a lot of lobbying that goes on both by the APWU and the other major postal unions. So there's certainly things in the works, and should the Democrats frankly get Congress, perhaps we'll see some of those actually come to the floor. Unfortunately, most Republican people in Congress have only supported privatization and not really looked at a way to maintain the Postal Service in its current form. And so they're unwilling to talk about a law that would remove those pre-funding requirements. But I think even beyond those requirements, the Postal Service isn't making money. You know, there's sort of two groups of ways that they can make their money. Number one is in their selling postage, which is their market dominant product. And that's controlled by Congress. How much they can charge for a stamp, how much they can increase that every year, that's controlled by statute. And the other way is the market competitive products like packages. You know, UPS, FedEx, other companies are also doing that. And so they can only charge as much as is competitive with the other providers. So it's just, you know, the way that it is right now, the Postal Service isn't making money. And in order to sort of shore it up, I think, you know, we're looking at subsidies and things like that, like Professor Clark was talking about earlier.
And I know we're out of time officially, so I do want to close on this point, which is, I mean, everything that we've discussed, all the questions at the end about what will happen if you can't deliver to these places, how do we change this law? The biggest thing that any of us can do is just vote for people who have the interests that you're talking about. If you have a concern, find a politician who has that same concern and has a plan to fix it and vote for them. Vote for, I'm not going to say vote for a specific party or a specific person, but vote for that issue is what essentially I'm saying. So I know we're out of time. I want to, I'm going to ignore the comment section, Mitchell. I'm going to hand it off to Gabby because I know just to allow her to promote real quick an event coming up with the Psychology Club at MSU in case anyone's interested.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, again. So we actually have another series. It's the Immigration and ICE series. And last week we had Sara's aunt present. And in continuance with that, we're going to have the Psychology Club, which I'm also part of at MSU. And we're going to be discussing the psychological effects of immigration, not only on the individual, but also society as well. Like I'm sure we can all, especially after our conversation last time, there's this idea that we have of what an immigrant looks like, what it is that they do. And a big part of that has to do with the Trump administration. So we're trying to like kind of unveil all the lies that have been put up and at the same time talk about the specific struggles that immigrants go through on a daily basis. So if you guys are interested in that, I recommend that you follow us on Instagram at ssj.glp or email us the same email at gmail.com. And that's basically it. But thank you guys so much again. Thank you to all our wonderful speakers for joining us today. And I guess that's it. We'll see you guys next week if you guys are willing to come. Thank you, everyone.
And that one's at
Thank you so
2:30,
much.
right, Gabby?
Yes, that one. Thank you for letting me know. That one is at 2:30 because it is at the time of the Psychology Club. But thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say thanks for having me, and I'm happy to stick around for 5 or 10 minutes if folks have more questions.
Oh, thank you, Rosie.
Cool.
Yeah, I thank you for having me. I could stick around for a few minutes too.
Likewise, I'm very glad to be here, and I can stick around if people have more questions as well.
Thank you. We're very glad. I mean, I know people are already leaving, but Shannon, I do want to point out, you had an instance a few weeks ago now, I believe, where you were at a post office and you got to talk to one of the employees. And I wanted to bring it up during the talk because it really was so poignant what you wrote to me. But if you could talk about that, I think that'd be, I mean, a great way of continuing this conversation.
Sure. So this was a couple of weeks back. I had to mail some documents and I was in the Farley post office, the main post office in Manhattan that's on 8th Avenue that sits directly across the street from Penn Station and Madison Square Garden. Post office named after James Farley, who was a long-serving postmaster general during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? So it's a post office named after an individual who's part of the New Deal, part of this, period in American history when we have this tremendous sort of expansion of, the kinds of public services that I think many of us want and believe that should be prerogatives of citizenship in our country. And I explained to the woman, the clerk, the member of the APWU who was helping me, that I was doing this for him. And I asked her, I said, what do you want people to know about the importance of the Postal Service? And she highlighted the importance of the Postal Service in making sure that retirees receive Social Security benefits, the importance of millions of people. I know this came up in one of the questions, receive medicine, so much of which is delivered by mail, and there would be devastating consequences, of course, for those people, if they were not to have access to universal postal delivery as we currently have it. But what she summed it up in the most eloquent way possible. She said, we serve the people and we are the people. And I thought that just so brilliantly, captured the importance of the Postal Service and the amazing jobs that hundreds of thousands of postal employees perform on a daily basis in our country, that it's such an important public service. And on the one hand, it's, we're in this sort of moment of crisis where we're trying to defend this critical public service, again, a public service that's actually mandated under our Constitution. But to build on a little bit of what Rosie said earlier, it's also an opportunity to try to sort of expand public services through this entity that exists in every community, even the smallest ones in our country. I know Rosie mentioned postal banking, but if we were to create, for instance, free public high-speed broadband, the postal system would be a logical agency to administer that kind of a system. And it would be sort of in keeping with this original idea of the Postal Service and why it's mandated constitutionally to guarantee the flow of information, which is essential to our democracy.
Catherine, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, really quick. So I guess I'm still a little caught up. Since the USPS is a constitutional right, how would the legalities work if it got to the point where there's no more funding for it and it would have to absolve? How would that work? Because it's a constitutional right. I'm just interested to see if anybody could explain that for me a little bit, because I don't know much about this, and I think it's very interesting and very important, and yeah.
That's a very good question. So in order to make a change to the Constitution, it actually requires a supermajority and of all the states. And it's a very complicated process. And as we've seen amendments take place over the years, it can be very difficult. So I think the answer is that, some sort of solution has to be made where either, funding is provided. That would be ideal, but it doesn't seem to be forthcoming. So, but there have been a lot of things that have happened during this administration that maybe don't really, toe the line in terms of the Constitution. So it'll be interesting to see, how this issue is resolved.
Just a quick, can Republicans get the Supreme Court to rule that only delivery of mail is required by the Constitution, not how necessarily it's paid for, or not if necessarily the U.S. Postal Service itself does it?
The current Supreme Court is with its 6-3 majority of conservatives is likely to rule in all kinds of ways. I would not put it past the current Supreme Court to rule that a privatization plan, for instance, if it were implemented, still satisfied that constitutional requirement. I think it might be clear to most of us that it does not, but my fear is that that the current Supreme Court is going to interpret all kinds of parts of the Constitution in what are, shall we say, curious ways. So that would be my fear.
Any other questions? Don't be afraid. I put the sources from today's panel into the group chat if anyone's interested in reading the task force recommendations or Brookings' piece on it. Let's see, HR 8015, what that act encompasses, etc. I do also want to say, so this panel was done as part of our Workers' Rights Committee. So, I mean, Gabby talked about, we have the Immigration and ICE committee as well, which she leads. But so, I mean, if anyone has any issues relating to workers' rights that they're interested in or that they have connections with, feel free to reach out to us. We are planning, I mean, by planning, it's in our heads so far. We haven't done any real work yet related to it, but we are planning an Amazon panel hopefully next semester. My own dad worked at Amazon for a short period during COVID and quit because of the conditions that he was expected to work under. So he'll probably be speaking. But I mean, if you care about doctors or healthcare professionals in this pandemic that we're experiencing, or any other labor force, reach out to us and we will make it happen as best we can, whether it's finding experts or people that actually worked in that field. We did try really hard to get a USPS worker to speak today, but unfortunately we couldn't. But we're very glad to have the speakers we did have. So, I mean, if there's no more questions, I think maybe we can end it there. Yes, okay. And gentle reminder that we do have our meeting next week. We'll probably be planning our Black History Month series, which I'll have a focus on Black Lives Matter, of course. And then, Gabby, what were the dates again for the Psych Club? And there's another one, right? Immigration Lawyer?
There was a confusion. So the Psych Club meeting is on November 18th at 2:30. But then before that, we are also having an immigration lawyer come in on November 11th. And that is at our usual time at 3:30. It's a little all over the place, but if you follow our Instagram or check us out, it'll make sense.
And our Instagram especially, I mean, last week, as she said, we had Angela Pace, my aunt, who's also, her father is with us today, John Pace. She spoke with us last week on her experience at the ICE borders. And we uploaded basically an informational slide of everything she covered almost directly following that. And I think, I mean, if any of you are friends with educators, or I mean, obviously we have students here, if you have educators who might be interested in using those informational slides, feel free to send them to us. I mean, we want these resources to be out there as much as possible. You know, we want them to be used. This recording will probably be going online. We'll figure out how that's going to work. Yeah, basically just follow us is what we're saying.
All right, I think that's it, everyone. Thank you again so much and take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure.
Thank you for coming. It means a lot.